Hello guys, so we are now at Dubai Fintech Summit and here with you Anna Tutova, co-founder of Coins Telegram, and our guest Monica Brand Engel, who is co-founder of Quona Capital. They just closed their third fund of $750 million, and they're focusing on investing into financial inclusion startups in MENA, South Africa and Latin America, so in developing regions. And as well, they invest not only into fintech, but I've seen as well into healthcare, agtech, and some other startups. So we'll hear more from you.
It's great to be here.
So can you tell us about your background? How did you get involved into the world of investments and fintech?
Happy to. So as you said, Quona is a venture firm focused on fintech for inclusion in emerging markets. And all those words are a lot about why I started Quona, co-founded with my two co-founders, Jonathan Whittle and Ganesh Rangaswamy. Quona is really an epitome of where my life led. I am half Peruvian, half American, come from a very mixed household, mixed religious, mixed ethnicity, and this notion of never quite fitting in perfectly in places is the sort of story of Quona. A lot of phenomenal opportunities and exciting activity happening on the margins. And our goal was to bring what's on the margins in the mainstream, and doing that by marrying profits and purpose. So we are an impact fund. We are delivering top quartile returns to our LPs and measuring impact in parallel. And we focus only on emerging markets. We do those other sectors you mentioned, but always through embedded finance.
And you were on the board of a lot of other fintech companies. Can you tell, what did you do before starting your own fund?
Yes, so I was on the operating side, actually. So my background, very similar to my co-founders, was in venture capital and on operating startups. So basically starting, scaling, and exiting financial services companies that served the mass market, the underserved, the unbanked. I actually started in the US in Silicon Valley. We were working it was a company called the Development Fund, and it was targeting small businesses and consumers that were just below the bank's criteria. So it was a multi-bank vehicle. It was funded by the banks, but it actually worked off their balance sheet because they weren't allowed to in their traditional credit policies. But actually, even in Silicon Valley, I did that till I went to Stanford Business School. And the idea that there was still a very compelling need in the emerging markets. I was in Silicon Valley during the 90s, during the heyday when the first internet boom happened. And I was still, even at that time, compelled to think about how do I go back to my roots. I actually ended up in Africa, mainly because at that point, South Africa was going through its own rebirth. It was when Mandela had come out of prison and actually looking to build a new country. So I ended up in South Africa. Worked in venture capital there before returning to the Americas, where I was head of product innovation. And the company was called Acción, and one of its partners, Comportamos in Mexico, became one of its most successful investments. I was helping them launch new financial products, insurtech, housing finance, and the company had an IPO in 2007. And that IPO funded the predecessor to Quona. It was a it was an on-balance sheet fund where the idea was, just as fintech was emerging in the US, we said, why can't we do fintech in emerging markets? So in 2008, we used the proceeds of the IPO to start a fund that basically invested in some very innovative companies in Africa, India, and in Latin America. And that caught the attention of JP Morgan and TIA, who were our anchors along with Acción on Fund 1. So it really was this story of living up the booms and the busts. So we had the booms of the 90s, we had the global financial crisis, and realizing even in bad times, there is opportunity.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So which regions do you see the most active now in terms of startup activity, innovations, Africa, MENA, or Latin America?
So again, I was telling you, I lived in Egypt last year. I love the MENA region. Our actually biggest markets, though, are actually Asia, South Asia, India being the core, with Indonesia being a fast second, and LATAM, with Brazil being the core and Mexico being the fast second. So they're still the overwhelmingly big parts of our portfolio. That said, Africa is the fastest growing. And in Africa, we have South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. Egypt is the newest market, but interestingly, and I shared this in the panel I was on earlier, Egypt now has become the number one VC in the most recent data collected, more VC deals being done in Egypt than even in South Africa, let alone Kenya or Nigeria.
Oh, wow.
So MENA is growing in importance, and so we're super excited about that.
And as well, can you share your investment criteria when you decide whether to invest into this or that startup?
100%. So our focus is fintech for inclusion. So the number one criteria that's binary is this company radically improving access and quality of financial services to the unbanked? If we can't answer yes, we don't look any further. Once we answer that question, we look at the deal like any venture capitalist. We look at the management team. And is this a breakthrough management team that's going to be able to see the company through the peaks and troughs? Is the business model will have a defensible competitive advantage? Is there a unique selling proposition that will really allow us to maintain margins and continue even when competition comes? Is the addressable market enormous? That's also very important. And also one of the challenges of Africa and MENA, each individual country is small. Collectively, they're huge, but you have to really be able to scale cross-border. So that's what we look at, in addition to a bunch of other criteria, but those are the most important.
So are this early stage mostly, or like what's the latest round you can invest?
Seed to Series A is our sweet spot. So seed plus. We usually like to see some evidence of product market fit. Doesn't have to be huge volumes of revenue, but we really are looking at some sort of post-revenue companies. We can go up to Series B, and we have, and actually we have a separate opportunity fund that actually invests even beyond Series C and higher. But again, our core is seed to Series A. We have done pre-revenue, we have done later, but the sweet spot is seed to Series A.
Nice. And as well, in your opinion, like in all these emerging markets, usually startup founders take the ideas which already exist in developed countries like US, and they just implement into those developing emerging economies. So do you see that, or do you see as well some completely innovative startups, the technologies which didn't exist yet in other regions at all?
What's the most exciting about our work is that we see this evolution. So certainly in the beginning, it was really, I would call it the copycat, right? There was a core business where there was an innovation in the US, as an example. You had Square or iZettle, which is allowing the acceptance environment to work for small businesses. We have a company in South Africa called Yoko that basically was modeled after not only that, but looking at newer versions like Adyen in Netherlands, or even PagSeguro in Brazil. So even that evolution of taking a model that existed and not only looking at developed markets, but looking at developing markets. It was copying more about what was going on in Brazil than Square in the US. So what we've seen is actually more south to south. And another example, most people in the US don't even know what social commerce is. Pinduoduo, one of the successful companies in China, inspired similar companies, B2B e-commerce and other social commerce in many of our emerging markets. So there are models that actually only exist in the emerging markets, mobile-led models, other types of social commerce that really exist because there's a massive underserved population that's really excited, looking for affordable, high-quality services.
And I saw you as well invest into one blockchain crypto startup,
Yes.
Pillow, for digital personal finance.
Yes.
Can you share, did you invest into any other blockchain startups? And generally, when did you discover blockchain crypto, and what's your take on it?
So we've been tracking blockchain and DeFi since its origins. We did not do anything in Fund 1, Fund 2 because the original use cases were very speculative, and we really are focused on the mass market. So we really wanted to wait for it to, and also regulatory-wise, we have a lot of regulated financial institutions that are LPs of ours. So we have to be careful in terms of how far along the edge we can experiment. But by Fund 3, which is the fund we're currently investing in now, there is actually a lot of legitimate, mainstream is a better word, a lot of mainstream powerful use cases, and you mentioned one of them, so wealth management. We actually had a couple of wealth management companies, one in Nigeria called Cowrywise, another one in India called Fisdom. So we learned a lot, and that was based on Betterment and other models in the developed world. But we learned there actually is a real hunger to access assets and manage wealth beyond just savings products. And so this notion that DeFi could provide a very powerful way for people to not only manage their money, but to build wealth. And that is what we're trying to solve: poverty. We're trying to solve income inequality. So this idea of actually using the DeFi and using the blockchain to bring new services is a beautiful model. And Pillow is particularly interesting because it's a company that started in India, looking at Nigeria. So this notion of that south to south, Like what can we do really leveraging the best of multiple markets in order to bring high quality services. So it's not the only, and then your last question, is it the only, it's not the only DeFi. I would say wealth management is one use case, and especially another one is USDC. We have a company in Latin America that actually looks at stablecoin to basically, again, similarly allow access to an emerging consumer to assets they wouldn't able to be able otherwise, they're not qualified investors. So this idea, again, of opening up markets to folks that might not have the profile. And the other use case that we're really excited about with DeFi is cross-border trading. So again, there are multiple use cases that we're seeing that really blend perfectly with our FinTech for Inclusion thesis.
So are there any other portfolio companies which are in DeFi space?
Yeah, so we have one, we have Kalisa in Latin America, we have Broom in Indonesia, so we have a few. We have I think 5 or 6 now, and we're again really excited to really help them scale and leverage our learnings globally.
Yeah, nice. It's quite important use case that all these blockchain DeFi applications enables the access to financial services for unbanked people.
Exactly, and I should say also some of our traditional or again mainstream fintechs are actually looking to incorporate elements. I'm not even counting those, which is even an additional use case that we're very excited about.
And how do you support the companies after you invest into them?
Our biggest support is this cross-fertilization. I was actually even talking to an open banking company last night about how do we bring lessons learned either from different regulatory regimes, different company experiences, even different realities. All of our management investment team is based on the ground. One of the statistics I'd like to share with people, we speak 19 languages at Kona. We're only 30 people, and and that includes our back office folks. That really tells you how embedded Kona is in our local markets and how much we bring that deep knowledge, the deep understanding, cultural, market, even consumer preferences to bear for our companies. So we do that as well as helping influence regulators. We're a purpose-driven fund. Our goal is to expand access for the majority. And so regulators, whatever side of the political spectrum you are, really value what we bring in terms of lessons learned. I have one colleague from Indonesia that just went to Brazil, and one of the outcomes is to actually bring the Central Bank of Brazil and to Indonesia to learn about DeFi regulation. So the Indonesian Central Bank wants to learn from Brazil, which has just passed some very interesting progressive regulation as they have here in the GCC.
Yeah, so what hurdles with regulatory regimes do you face?
I would say
so where do you see the best regulation regimes for fintech startups and as well for blockchain crypto?
So I would say the biggest hurdle I would say, and again, I really believe regulators are trying to do the right thing. I really believe they're well-meaning. I think the hardest thing is to think you're going to solve this in a room with a bunch of closed doors and a deck. The only way you figure this out is by being in the market. You have to create a sandbox. You have to, of course, create some parameters, but I would really encourage regulators to go in and actually test out, create parameters, test out and make mistakes, live with failures. You can recover. The worst is to spend a ton of time in the back, have a very detailed prescriptive regime which has unintended consequences. Even the best thought out, the most well-intentioned regulatory framework is going to have things you didn't anticipate. So my biggest advice is experiment. And number one. Number two is engage fintechs and investors. They also don't want to evade regulation. They actually want to do things in the right way. And we have found the most success when we worked collaboratively with regulators, just the way we did in Brazil, to actually say, how do we begin informing each other? I just sat on a panel actually with the Central Bank of India and with Kenya, who are also a little bit more restrictive, but are at least trying to inform themselves of how can we develop new regimes. And so I would say, in terms, I like that you pick me, who do I like? So I would say the regulators that we have been most impressed with, and they're not exclusive, I would say here in the GCC, what they're doing, the DIFC, and even in Saudi Arabia, the experimentation I think is fantastic. And I think Brazil really should get credit. They have really created a beautiful enabling environment, and innovation has flourished.
What about Egypt, where you told that you see the most innovation?
Thank you, I'm so sorry. I love Egypt. So I should have mentioned the Central Bank of Egypt, which also has really tried to push forward. They have developed a number of regulations in terms of fintech in particular. They even helped sort of put capital and give incentives to banks to both provide equity and debt to fintechs. So I think they've done a fantastic job. So I think again this real commitment to see how can we through our regulatory policy encourage innovation is something that we want to see more of.
And on the personal side, do you invest into crypto yourself?
I do. I both do personal investing, and we're looking, we each have a toehold investment that each partner gets to do that actually is one that we can do with fewer votes from the broader investment committee, and I really, really like to do DeFi. I'm actually looking, particularly here in the GCC, I think there's some phenomenal companies, so stay tuned.
Can you share maybe some tokens, coins you invested into?
Well, again, I actually, I invested early on in Ethereum, but again, I would say that's not for me, it's less about the tokens, it's more about the business models. That's where I'm actually putting, I actually have also some seed investments.
Actually does now quite, Vitalik recently went to, I think, Kenya and Nigeria.
Exactly.
To Africa.
And that's one of the reasons I chose it. I actually wanted to follow it and actually see, and just the way Coinbase decided to come here, announced that this morning, I actually think there are some really exciting use cases in emerging markets, and so that's what I'm most interested in. Again, it's where I do my core investing in and where I think there's real opportunity.
And which year did you start investing into crypto?
2019. Yeah. So again,
there's still bear markets.
Yeah. Yes. So very modestly. Again, that's not where I'm going to make my fortune. Most of my game-changing personal wealth will be in Quona. That's where we put our money where our mouth is. We have a GP commit. That's part of where we put our capital. But we also experiment a little bit so that we also educate ourselves by doing. So it's not just asking our companies and our LPs. We put our own capital with experimentation.
And what the next trends do you see, and what type of companies do we really need to ensure the financial inclusion in the emerging markets?
So where we are seeing a lot of it, or our thesis is really focused, we call it on version 2.0 of fintech. So in version 1.0, you had pure play lenders, like one that lends directly to small businesses, or like the payments company that does merchant acceptance. Where we see opportunity now is version 2.0, where two things are happening. We're rebundling services that might have been, for example, we have a company called Hasna that's based in Egypt, moving to Saudi Arabia, that does early wage access, which is a pure play lender, but it also is a Visa card issuer. So under one roof, you actually have multiple business lines that are super synergistic. So they deposit their early wage loans onto the Visa card in a Sharia compliant way, and really interesting synergies that are promoting utilization of both. So what we call the rebundling, challenger banking would be another example in that. The second area of thesis that we're super excited about is infrastructure. So there, for example, you have payments companies, well, it could be payments that are providing rails, like open banking rails, but also that are providing banking as a service. For example, there's a company in India called Bureau that actually is here at the Dubai Fintech, and they provide kind of compliance and other fraud checking. And that's a very valuable service not only to banks but to other fintechs. So we see this kind of second order type of fintech that actually is beginning to create a very interoperable and broader ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your expertise and thoughts with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.